Alright, so today I have a bit of a different video than what I normally make. It's basically a timeline of a certain trajectory of literature, and I'll just run down the books that I have spread out, which I admit is somewhat crazy, but it's relevant, if you'll see. So these are some of them. Alright, so back to the beginning. So as you may have guessed or not, this is about the trajectory of medieval epics and medieval romances, because they're pretty intertwined. And one of the main starts to this tradition is the Song of Roland. This is a very nice edition. It's a Penn State, and actually mine came from the Northwestern University Library, which I thought was neat. It's always a terrible shame whenever I get a book from a good library, but I guess this is only the second copy, so maybe they still have the first one. But yeah, the Song of Roland is an anonymous French epic poem that talks about Charlemagne going into Spain, and he is attacked by the Muslim forces there at Roncesvalles, I think is how you say it. And it's written in kind of a classic epic poem tradition. Not classic in the sense of Virgil, but it is in that tradition. And it was written a little bit after Beowulf, so you can kind of put it in that time period. It's also in similar anonymous medieval epic poem like the Song of the El Cid. And yeah, just another little thing. This video is going to be more of like a really shallow survey type video, and then I imagine going into more detail gradually as time goes on, because I can kind of see myself getting into these things like I got into the modernists, which I feel like I had quite a few successful videos about the modernists as I continued, even though maybe some of the first ones were a little bit surface level. But yeah, I'm going to kind of speed through these first few, because they're not exactly related to what I'm talking about. They're just more of like getting ready. So next I have in this group is the Troubadours, the French poets from the region of Provence. And this first one here is one of my favorites. I'd say it's actually my favorite. It's by Paul Blackburn, translated by Paul Blackburn, who was a poet in like the Black Mountain, Charles Olson, Robert Duncan group. I also put him in my mind with Frank O'Hara as far as his style of writing, but he did actually formally study the Troubadours in Old French, and he did this excellent translation, which is obviously by NYRB. And yeah, I love it very much, and it's excellent translations, really excellent translations. And also here I have this book of the women troubadours, which is underappreciated. And then this really nice bilingual edition of Troubadour Verses, which is published by University of Chicago. And I don't like this one quite as much, but it does have translations, as you can see here, by Ezra Pound. So if you are interested in troubadours, I know I've made a video about them before and talked about 2 of the 3 video books there. I would recommend reading at least the Provenza Anthology of Troubadour Poetry. And that leads us to our next group here, which is Chretien de Troyes, who wrote his Arthurian Romances, which is the second major ingredient that we will lead into. So, as you may know, the King Arthur comes from mainly a oral tradition of a king, possibly a Welsh king from the 600s, 700s. No one really knows very much about him, but as far as written history, you can find him in Geoffrey of Monmouth, which, there's Penguin Classics of it. And that's really the first really widely read version of the King Arthur histories. And then a couple hundred years later, you have the French who really get into the tradition. You also have Germans who do it, but Chretien de Troyes is really the trajectory that we'll be seeing here. And this is all the really well-known Arthurian romances. So we have Eric and Enid, Glige, Knight of the Cart, Lancelot, Yvain, Percival, and this later goes into the Wagner operas that are related to this, which are based on the German, but they all have a common origin, and they were basically talking with each other. I really do have a strong interest in getting the German ones, but they're all very expensive, or they're written in or something. I've found several of them, but of course a couple you can find really cheap, but yeah. Anyway, so there's the Arthurian Romances that will lead into what we're talking about. And then here I have a really nice thing. This is a publisher I want to talk about more. It's the Early English Text Society. No, I don't think that comes out very clearly, but and this comes from the manuscript of the Cotton Nero, which is a series of manuscripts collected by an antiquarian named Cotton. He named them after figures of Roman history. But this is actually a facsimile of the Queene, or pearl poet they call him, I guess. So here's facsimile. It's actually the manuscript. And as you see, here's the first page. And this is the pearl. My privy pearl without a spot. Yeah. This is one of my favorites to just look at, because you can see their handwriting. It is quite hard to read, but I just think it's so fun to read it. And anyway, the Gawain and the Green Knight is in the Arthurian tradition. Oops. Oh well, I'll put that in later. I forgot to put in the first one I took out. All right, and then next in this group is kind of an outlier. I just kind of wanted an excuse to talk about it. But it does kind of fit into this Italian tradition, because all the Italian poets that we'll see here knew about Dante and referenced Dante, and even though they didn't so much explicitly base their works off his. So, clearly Dante here. And I found this book pretty randomly. I didn't know about it before I found it, but once I found it, it's excellent. Paget Toynbee, who is the editor of the Oxford Complete Works of Dante in the Italian. So, he's extremely knowledgeable of Dante. And Robert Hollander is the introduction of this, which did a full translation of the Inferno. The comedy with the Inferno, Purgatory, and Paradise. But I marked a section of this book which is really nice. So it's a series of anecdotes by Dante, and I used a Feminist Press bookmark for obvious reasons. So I'll just read it here. You may not be able to read it actually through the video, but one of the earliest anecdotes that is told by Petrarch of Dante at the court of Can Grande della Scala at Verona after he had been exiled from Florence. Dante Alighieri, erewhile my fellow citizen, was a man greatly accomplished in the vulgar tongue, but on account of his pride he was somewhat more free in his manners and speech than was acceptable to the sensitive eyes and ears of the noble princes of our country. Thus, when he was exiled from his native city and was a guest at the court of Can Grande, at that time the refuge and resort of all who were in misfortune, he was at first held in high honor, but afterwards by degrees he began to lose favor and day by day became less pleasing to his host. Among the guests at the time were, according to the custom of those days, mimics and buffoons of every description, one of whom, an impudent rascal, by means of his coarse remarks and broad jest made himself a universal favorite and a person of considerable influence. Can Grande, suspecting that this was a cause of vexation to Dante, sent for the buffoon, and after lavishing praise upon him, turned to Dante and said, I wonder how it is that this man, fool though he be, understands how to please us all and is petted by everyone, while you, for all your reputed wisdom, can do nothing of the kind. Dante replied, You would hardly wonder at that if you remembered that like manners and like minds are the real causes of friendship. And then there's another kind of similar anecdote that he says someone gets rewarded for being a buffoon. And then he showed it to Dante and said, You with all your letters and sonnets and books have never received a present like this. It's a fancy coat. To which Dante answered, What you say is true, and this has fallen to you and not to me, because you have found your likes and I have not yet found mine. There, you understand that. And then John Gower gives a quote of Dante too. So I just thought that was nice. And then I have the complete comedy in the John Giardi translation, which is the one I found to like the most. And then here is kind of starting in where I'd like to focus in this video. So this is Morgante by Luigi Polcie, which is a comedic verse romance from around the time of Leonardo da Vinci. He was roughly a contemporary of him. And I got this one from the New York Public Library. I just recently got it, the Mid-Manhattan Library. Yeah, I made sure to rub it down in case it had coronavirus on it, but no, I'm kidding. And yeah, as you see, Luigi Polcie, 1432 to 1484. So this was quite old. But this one here, he mentions Dante in the first couple stanzas. It starts off like a typical epic. Kind of. In the beginning was the Word near God. God was the Word, and so the Word was He. This I believe in the beginning was, and not about Him ever can be done. Therefore, O Lord, who art so just and good, of all thy angels send one down to me, so that well-guided I recall and tell an old and famous worthy story well. So that's the, what he's going to talk about, the invocation of the Muse, and then the Virgin Daughter, and then I think he mentions Dante on the second page. Yeah, down here, where he talks about Charles Roncesvalles after the dolorous defeat, as Dante says in his comedy, Talks about Charles and Paris. And then this is where we start to get a bit of a mix of the Arthurian tradition and the Song of Roland tradition. And I have to say, this is the one I know the least about because I've read some of it from my university library, and then I decided it was very enjoyable to read, and I got my own edition. And I have not read much of it yet, although it has been very fun to read what I have read. But as you can see, it is quite large, 1,000 pages, so a lot to look forward to. Next, we have Orlando Innamorato, which starts the tradition that leads to Orlando Furioso, which I'll talk about next. But he was basically a contemporary of the Luigi Polcie from the first quarter of the 1400s and died, I think, in the 1480s, 1482 maybe 1490 something. But this translation here is actually bilingual. So it has the Italian on the whole left side, and then it has the English on the right, which is very lucky, because if you try to find that in any other of these editions, you can't find it. I mean, of course you can find it in Dante, which is really nice. But if you try to find it in some of the books I talk about later, you just can't. You have to buy it on your own in 2 separate editions. But Orlando Innamorato, it's a court romance, epic type poem. He was in the d'Este family, which was one of the wealthiest families in Italy at the time. And he wanted to write a romance that would impress them and bring, honor to them, which is really one of the things that holds me back from totally enjoying this whole tradition of literature, because it's not that the artists weren't top-level artists, because they were, but they weren't able to fully express their skill and genius because they always had to either hide things skillfully from the families that paid them, like, for example, Shostakovich had to do in his music, or they had to just simply appeal to them, which, being wealthy is not correlated with being intelligent or appreciative artistically or even skilled artistically. Sometimes it does happen to overlap, but it's very unlikely. And I'll talk about that with a few of these later books too, because I feel like it does really impact these works in a way that modernism is not nearly as impacted. Because by the time modernism comes around, enough people can read that you don't have to appeal to, let's say the President of the United States, for example, which would be hilarious if artists had to please the President to be printed, or had to please J.P. Morgan or Bill Gates or something like that. I mean, that would be terrifying if that's what we had to do. And in some sense, I suppose it is still that way, but not even close to what it used to be. But tangent aside, Orlando Innamorato is the story of Orlando falling in love with a woman and showing off his chivalric skill and his bravery and his total like, the phrase head over heels love for this woman. And it goes through the typical chivalric romance tropes of horses, knights, jousting, running all over the place, really crazy plots, plot holes all over the place. Doesn't matter. But it is really touching in some parts, and it does really make you, well, I mean, it made me think a lot about love. I haven't read the whole thing, because it is another one of these really long ones, and I'm not as interested in it as I am in Orlando Furioso, but it is really nice to be able to read. And kind of something related to that is I've been looking into the linguist Joseph Wright. He taught J.R.R. Tolkien at Oxford. He was a more or less self-taught linguist who did a lot of research into dialects, English dialects, and did a lot of research in Old English and Old Germanic languages. Wrote some of the grammars, did I think a 6-volume dialect dictionary of different English dialects. And yeah, he's a very interesting guy, and one of my friends was showing me parts of his 2-volume biography published in the 30s. And there was this anecdote where he said to someone that he almost never went to libraries because going to a library takes time, and time is money. And he would rather just buy the books so that he had them always at his home that he could look at. And it's so funny because that's exactly how I feel, because you can always go to the library. Let's say you're just laying in your bed and thinking. You think about a book you want to read. Let's say Orlando Innamorato, which is absolutely not digitized. And you think, okay, I want to read it. So then you think, okay, when do I have, a couple hours to go to the library to check it out? I never have a couple hours to go to the library. And then you'll think, oh, well, maybe in a couple weeks. Well, for me, if you're anything like me, a couple weeks, you're going to be on to something else if you don't already have it started. So, that doesn't work. And in that way, time is money, in the sense that I would rather buy it, have it here, so that one night, if I end up interested in it for some reason, I can just look at it and enjoy it, and then that's that. So, just above it, I have a couple of books that are somewhat related, at least in the historical aspect. I have Teofilo Folengo, Baldo, and this is by the extremely excellent Harvard Itati Renaissance Library. And I first found Baldo by looking up macaronic literature, which is literature that uses 2 languages. And it originally meant Latin and Italian, but now it's been more generalized to works that use multiple languages. Like, for example, Spanish and English could be macaronic literature now in its more generalized term. But this actually was one of the originators of the term. And it's a mock heroic epic from Folengo was from 1491 to 1544. So he was a contemporary of Ariosto, which we have coming up next. But yeah, this, as Macaronic mentions, this is written in Latin and different dialects of Italian. They're written mixed. And unfortunately, I don't read either of those, but we're lucky enough to have a literal prose translation of it on the right. And it is a very funny book, too. It's a 2-volume edition, so you'd have to get both volumes, which they are a little pricey, so you'd have to think about that. But one of the really interesting things about this, Cosimo de' Medici. So the de' Medici family is another one of the de Este families. Well, if you don't know about it already, Baldo was a very strong influence on another book about giants, like Morgante is, Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel, which is, very, very common to find. You can find really cheap paperbacks, but I had known about Rabelais for years before I ever heard about Morgante, before I ever heard about Baldo, before I ever heard about any of these Italian books, basically. But Rabelais was, very knowledgeable and knew about all this. Like I mentioned in my, it was actually my last video of, talking about him. So that's just kind of like a nice little addition to what we're talking about. And then next, we have one of the main focuses of this. We have Ariosto's Orlando Furioso, and there are really 2 main current translations. You have this one here, which is by Barbara Reynolds. I should say here, Barbara Reynolds. It's in 2 parts. Penguin did. They're both really thick, so it's kind of hard to read all at once if you want to carry both volumes. But then this is a verse translation, as you can see. And I'll show you how it starts. Of ladies, cavaliers, of love and war, of courtesies and of brave deeds I sing, in times of high endeavor when the Moor had crossed the sea from Africa to bring great harm to France, when Agramante swore, in wrath, being now the youthful Moorish king, to avenge Troiano, who was lately slain upon the Roman Emperor Charlemagne. So it has the Charlemagne, which is the Orlando influence, and then, of course, Orlando, Song of Roland. And it gives you the, Homeric and Virgilian of arms and man I sing, or of rage of Achilles I sing. And then this one is really good for its introductory matter. It has like 80-some pages of an introduction where it gives you all the rundowns of the Arthurian tradition that influences it, and then the Roland tradition, and it is a verse translation, so I think it does really give you something that a prose translation can't. There is a prose translation by the Oxford World Classics by Guido Waldman, who also does the Boccaccio of the Oxford World Classics, which I've been reading recently, and I partially got on this whole thing by a teacher I had. I was taking a class on Edmund Spenser, Faerie Queene. We only read the Faerie Queene. And unfortunately, I couldn't continue that class because that was when the fire happened. But I did learn a lot from that class, actually, shockingly enough. Learning from a university class. And she recommended Orlando Furioso, and that's really the thing that got me on this track. It was about a year ago, roughly, I'd say. Yeah, it was almost exactly a year ago. And she recommended the Guido Waldman just to kind of read it, just to kind of get information from it, basically. Learn the plot, learn what influenced Edmund Spenser, which we'll see later. And I found I don't enjoy that very much, actually. I trusted her. I mean, I got the Guido Waldman, and I don't like it as much. It's good for information if you just want to blast through it, absolutely. But my favorite translation is actually the one I have below here. This is the translation from 1591 by Sir John Harington. And I was lucky enough to find it in a facsimile edition, which was done in 1970. And this is another one of my favorite, along with the Early English Text Society. Da Capo Press worked with Theatrum Orbis Terrarium with this English Experience series. It's record in early printed books published in facsimile. There are some amazing books in this series. Absolutely unbelievably amazing. And unfortunately, they are expensive and very not well known. I've been watching some of Andrew B's videos, and he talks about Brill as a publisher from the Netherlands. And, this is another one of those amazing Netherlands, Amsterdam publishers, 1970. Unfortunately, I will have to kind of start speeding through because I only have about 10 more minutes on this. But as you see here, this is an actual facsimile. They took pictures of it, and I think I showed this a little bit before with the library edition that I had gotten, but this is actually one I was able to find for relatively cheap. And, this just gives you such a better feeling for it. And one of the most touching stanzas that I've been thinking of is this one here, 41 of the first book. So, this is, so he's chasing his woman that he's found, and Angelica, and he's running away. She's running away, and he's trying to follow her. And let's see. Oh yeah, next page. She stops in a place to take a rest because she's all dirty, has mud all over her. She finds a little shade and a tree to stop by, and he happens upon her, and she's hidden and he doesn't know. So this is what it is in the 1591 translation. Alas, said he, what means this diverse passion? I burn as fire, and yet like frost I freeze. I still lament and never move compassion. I come too late, and all my labor lease. I had but words and looks for show and fashion, but others get the game and gainful fees. If neither fruit nor flower come to my part, why should her love consume my careful heart? And there are other just extremely nice parts of this, but there are also the kind of ridiculous parts that you have to expect from, he always mentions like mastiffs, and as lions meet, or bulls in pastures green, with teeth and horns and stained with blood the field, such eager fight these warriors was between, and either spear had pierced the toucher to other's shield. So, if you can find this in a library, at least, I would highly recommend reading it. It is, I gather, a bit of a challenge to read this old type, but for me, it wasn't really a problem at all, so don't let it put you off if it seems a bit unusual. And the funny thing is, he gives a summary of each book after he translates it. He gives an argument, and then he gives a summary, and as you see here, there are little notes throughout the whole thing, and pictures and things, so it's absolutely excellent, absolutely excellent. And then, unfortunately, I have to speed through these next ones. I can make other videos, but next here in the tradition, we have Toccata Tasso with the liberation of Jerusalem, or Jerusalem delivered. And then there's an older translation by Edward Fairfax, Godfrey of Bouillon. I've come to find that this Max Wickert translation is the best. There's another one by Anthony Esterlin, who also does Dante translations, which is good. If you can get that one, it's good, but this one is the one I enjoy the most. I'm not sure how its fidelity to Italian, but at least this one feels the best, feels the most agile. And it is a historical epic instead of being a chivalric romance. It's an epic of the First Crusade, where the Western forces came to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslim owners. And you get this same invocation. I sing of war, of holy war in him, captain who freed the sepulchre of Christ. Greatly he wrought by force of mind and limb, and greatly suffered, nobly sacrificed. And then an errant knight. And Tasso was heavily influenced by Ariosto, who had published Orlando Furioso about 50 years or so before Tasso did this. This was 1581. Ariosto started in 1516 and continued to the 1530s, adding on stuff. Rinaldo, Tasso's father, was an epic poet, and 2 years before Tasso published Rinaldo, his father published an epic poem when Tasso was 16, I believe. And then by the time he was 18, he had written his own, and this is Rinaldo. This is heavily based in the Roland, Song of Roland tradition. And that's also by Max Wickert. Next, we have Edmund Spenser's Faerie Queene, which I'd like to talk about more because I've been thinking about it a lot for the last year. But I'm seeing I won't be able to, so I'll talk about that more in a later video. Another one you can look at if you're interested in this type of stuff is English literature in the 16th century, excluding drama, by C.S. Lewis. He focuses mostly on Edmund Spenser and Philip Sidney. This is Arcadia by Philip Sidney, which is a prose romance. And this edition is excellent, Cambridge University Press, because it has the original spelling. And in this book by C.S. Lewis, he talks about the influence of Orlando Innamorato, Orlando Furioso, Toccado Tasso on Edmund Spenser and Philip Sidney. And then this whole video has basically been chapter 6 of part 1 of Don Quixote, where the priest goes in and finds all Don Quixote's books that led him to be mad and burns them. And he only saves a couple. He saves Ariosto, he saves Amadis of Gaul, and I think the third one he really saves is Tirant Blanche, which is the Catalan one from 1490. And Cervantes clearly loved these himself. Next, I have in the tradition Milton's Paradise Lost, who took influence from Spenser, from Sidney, Tasso, Furioso, Dante, all the way back. He knew everything, and I wanted to include that at the end here. And then also to try to show some love to the Victorians, which is usually very difficult to do, I have another book from a library, Lake Travis. But I only brought this to show Sordello, which is Robert Browning's epic poem that he wrote when he was 28 about Sordello, who is a troubadour poet that you can find in Dante's comedy. And it's an epic poem about an artist. And this is one that Ezra Pound said was the last epic poem in the tradition that you can follow. It's the last worthy one. So unfortunately, I went a little slow in the beginning and had to speed up in the end here. But I would really enjoy making another few videos about these things at least. So Yeah, let me know if you enjoyed it. Let me know if you've read any of these and what you think about them, and any recommendations on books I left out. So, thanks for watching. Death is a Gang Boss.